Hello everyone, how you guys doing? All good, I hope. Thank you all for tuning in today. I'm Narinder Singh and I'll be your speaker for the next 40 minutes. We will be discussing all things custom property editor. What is it, what's the use case, and how we can build one. Also, I'll be doing a demo towards the end of the session where we see how we can build a custom property editor from scratch. Before we begin, a huge shout out to our sponsors. Without them, this event wouldn't be a reality. And don't stop clapping yet. A big thanks to you too. Thank you for joining us and making this event a huge success. Who am I? I am Narendra Singh, as you already may know. I'm currently working as a senior developer at Sales5, a consulting partner based in Germany. I'm a three-time Salesforce MVP and I also write about Salesforce stuff on my blog Force Panda. If you have any questions after the presentation, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. These are my handles. Looking forward to engage with you guys. All right, let's do this. Let's start first by defining what is a custom property editor. What you are seeing on the left side of the screen is a screenshot of a custom Apex action that allows you to send emails. And you might have already noticed that it has a lot of inputs. And by looking at the scroll bar, we can already tell that there are a lot more. Now, for someone using this action in their flow, configuring the action is not straightforward because there are just too many inputs. So user has to go through each input and put in the value if necessary. Now let's take a look at a transform version of the same action. Doesn't this action look much more simpler to use? But the question is, how did we create this? We did it by using some magic sauce called custom property editor. Now, this there is no magic sauce as such. It's just basically simply put, a custom property editor is a Lightning Web component that provides a custom UI for entering values for your Apex action or a custom flow screen component that is built using LWC. Here is another example of how a custom property editor can really simplify a complicated set of inputs for a flow screen component. For a component like you see on the left, you will most likely want to have a how to use documentation that specifies the use of each input. Whereas if you switch to your right, you see the same component but with a much more easy to use configuration setup. In case if you are interested, you can find both the quick choice and send rich email components on unofficialsf.com. Now this might be quite obvious. The flow builder by default auto-generates a one-size-fits-all or a generic property editor for all the components and actions. When building an Apex action or a screen component, anything you mark as an input simply shows up on the UI for admins to configure. Now this generic property editor has been working fine, but with the growing popularity of flows, a lot of custom solutions are now flow specific, and we see a lot of solutions that are being built on flows. And as the actions and screen components get more and more sophisticated, their configuration get increasingly complex. And you can already tell that by looking at example on your right, which is a dependent picklist component which is available in flows. Interestingly, for those who may not know, custom property editor went GA quite a while ago, but it is still not very popular in the ecosystem. However, I think they will become more and more relevant in the days to come because Flow is just too popular to ignore now. Now let us take a look at where we can use custom property editors. This may be already quite obvious, but just to put it out there, you can create custom property editors for Apex actions, which are also known as invocable methods, and also you can build them for custom Lightning Web components that are available for Flow screens. Just a quick note, custom property editor is not available for custom Flow screen components that are built using Aura. Let us now take a look at how we can use custom property editor for an Apex action. quick reminder again, custom property editor is basically a LWC. So here is an example of how you can link your custom property editor component to your Apex action. All you need to do is you have to specify your component's name in the configuration editor property of your invocable method. And that's basically it. And now let's also take a quick look at how you can use a custom property editor for a flow screen component that is built using LWC. Here is an example of XML configuration file for a Lightning Web component that is using a custom property editor. So in the target config property, you can specify the configuration editor attribute with the name of the Lightning Web component that you want to use as the custom property editor. And before we move to our demo, let's quickly talk about some fundamental stuff which will really help you while creating a custom property editor. So, custom property editor JavaScript interface. Basically, this JavaScript interface is going to be your best friend while creating custom property editors. What I mean by this is this JavaScript interface exposes certain properties, functions, and events that you can use while creating your custom property editors and interact with the flow. To start with, we have builder context. So builder context is basically a property that contains all the information about your flow. And when I say all, it literally means everything that you have in your flow, all the metadata, all that information is available in this builder context property. Next up, we have input variables. Input variables is basically an array of input variables that you have in your screen component or Apex action. And each input variable inside this array has properties called name, value, and value data type. Next, we have validate function. You can use this function to basically validate your inputs when an admin is configuring your flow action or screen component. And based on the inputs you receive in the custom property editor, you can validate and throw an exception if you would like. Next, we have element info. You wouldn't be using this property too much, but basically what this property helps you with is it has an API name and the type of the element that you are currently using. You may want to use it in a situation where you have multiple instances of the same action or component in that case, and you want to do some conditional logic. So in that case, you can use this element info variable to figure out which element are you in currently. And then we have three different kinds of events that this JavaScript interface provides, which are basically used to say that input value is changed or input value is deleted or generic type mapping is changed. And these you can use these events to interact with the flow builder and let the flow builder know that there is a change in the value or the value is deleted for an input. Quick note, I have purposefully skipped one property which is generic type mapping. I just did not want to overload too much information for a beginner's session as a if you want to start learning, because that could be a little complicated if you haven't worked with generic types in Apex or LWC. So yeah. Alright, so I think we are good to go for a demo now. So I'll be switching over to my VS Code and let's see how we can build a custom property editor from scratch. Alright, so let's switch to VS Code. So I have switched to my VS Code and I've taken up a very simple use case where I'm saying that we want to build a custom property editor for an Apex action that concatenates two strings. Now, this isn't really a useful or let's say practical use of custom property editor for a use case like this, but it's good enough for you to give a clear picture of how the workflow looks like when you want to build a custom property editor, and it gives you a very good idea if you want to start with custom property editors. So yeah, that's what we will use as our use case. And to start, we need an Apex action which actually concatenates two strings. So for that, I already have created a class, and let's quickly go review this class. So I have a class which has a method in it, and it basically takes action inputs, a class type of action input, and returns back a list of action output type class. Essentially, the input class has two inputs, str1, string1, and string2, str2, and as an output, it simply gives us back a concatenated string. So let's take a quick look at the method. The method basically iterates over the list of inputs, and for each set of input, I call a function which concatenates the two strings here, and in here I'm just validating the string. If the string is null, then I'm returning an empty string so that you don't get an error. Okay, so that's how our concat action looks like. So now what we need is a CPE component or LWCE component that we can use in our Apex action. So let's start with that, and let's create a web component. Let's call this concat action CPE. Alright, so we can already use this if we push this to our scratch org. So I just want to give you a quick glimpse of how it looks. So for now, what I'll do here is I'll say I my phone and I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna save this. Now if I head over to my scratch org and I have a flow here, and if I use the action and I say concat action, let's see if we can find this. No. Let me see what's the name of the concat action. Okay. Oh, concat. Yeah. So concat string. We see str1 and str2 as two inputs. Now what we are going to do here is override the standard UI that is generated by the flow builder using our custom property editor. So that's what I'm going to do now, and hit cancel, and I'm going to go here and I'll say configuration editor if I get it correctly, I think, and then c is for the namespace since we do not have a namespace for the scratch of, so C. Then we say concat action CEP. This is similar to how you reference or use Lightning components within Lightning components. And I think this should be good. Let's verify this from the documentation if we have somewhere. Yeah, so that's how you basically do it. And I'm gonna save this and let's see how what changes it shows up on the UI or the when we use the action on the flow. So I'm gonna go back here and I'll refresh this flow builder and I'll say screen flow. Inform action contact string. So what we see here is actually the HTML part that we have in our CPE. Hi, my first CPE. So the first step is complete, that you have now a CPE which basically overrides your standard UI. Now what you want to do is work on your CPE and basically integrate it with the Apex action to make it work. So to begin with, what we actually need is two sets of inputs. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do LWC component library. Go here, find text. We want input text. Input is the right one. So we will be using two sets of inputs, and it's a type is text, label string 1, and then we will call this, let's give it a name as str1. Try and use the same references for the same input because it's more consistent and it's easier, and we will also see some advantages when we will code this solution. And similarly, let's do string 2, text input string 2 str2. So this, if we save this, and also let's save this flow so we don't have to go here again and again. I don't think we can save this because it will give an error because the inputs are not binded. Just to give you what I'm talking about, if I say x and say done, it shows two errors. That it but you don't really see the error is because your action inputs at the action level are not populated, they are not linked to any value. That's why you are getting this error. It's basically showing those errors saying that you need an input or something like that. So that's why we are not able to save this. So this is what we have. Now we head over to our controller, the JavaScript controller, and we have to define input variables property. And then we are also going to define str1, str2 as the inputs. And I think we may also want to say value equals str1, str2. All right. So the first thing that we need to do is, imagine your component loads, and if you have some configuration, you have to set the input. So what basically we will do is we will use connected callback and say set flow inputs. This, and what we will do here is we will loop through each input that we have, and we will say set the value of the input. So let's say we want to where also you need to specify what inputs you want to say. I missed this, so we will say this accepts a list of inputs, names of basically inputs, so which are str1 and str2. These dates are actually corresponding to the names of input that you have in your action. So this must be same as this in order to make it work, because this is what is being saved in the input variable array. So that's what we will do. So for each set of inputs, we will do inputs dot for each uh we'll say variable name, do something which we will define later. And here we will say this dot variable name is equal to now we have to loop over this array and find the variable which matches the name. So what we will do here is we'll define another function which says get input variable value, and we will say variable name. It takes a variable name. So the first thing is you need to check if the input variable that you are supplying, the name of the input variables that you are supplying is actually in the input variable list. So you will say uh, let's call it input variable, and we will say this dot get input variable name. This is a good function name. If you're wondering how I got this suggestion, is because of tab 9. We can talk about this later. So I'll define this function here which takes a variable name and scans through this array of input variables dot find, simply forgot to do return dot find, and here we have to say input variable input variable and input variable. And if you remember that each input variable in the input variables array has name, has value, and value data type. So we just going to compare this with name, and that's basically it. So this will return us this, and if this has a value, we can simply say uh, in this case we want to input dot value, sorry, input variable dot value, and finally, oh, one sec, no, uh, silly. And here if nothing is here, then we return simply a null. Okay, so typically this is not the right way to do this, because each input variable has a type. So if it's a number type, by default it returns the value of the input variables is stored as string. So you have to convert them and then accordingly return. So it can be a boolean, it can be a number. So if it's a number, then you have to convert this with the number function saying in number and then input variable value. And the way it works for the boolean is that it actually stores the hardcoded string as global constant blah blah blah. So you have to actually do You have to actually compare the whole string as global constant dot true equals triple equals input variable dot value, and that would actually return uh, true, otherwise false. So yeah, that's how you would do it if you have it normally in this. But since in this case we know that the data type is string, so we don't need to really worry about it. So we will keep things simple. And yeah, I think our logic is done. So we can just call this function here and say variable name. So again, to catch up what we have done, basically the reason why we need to set flow inputs, which are these, is because when your flow loads or your CPE, when you open up your CPE when you are building the flow, or especially when editing the flow, the inputs that you have mapped to those inputs, or the values that you have mapped to those inputs, must show up when you render it, because first time it will be null, but when you render it the next time, the values that are set has to be there, so that you don't get confused that the values are not there. So that's what we are doing. So we are iterating over the input variables array, and we are getting those values for each input, and we are setting the input in the lightning input text component, base component. So that's the first part. That's the setting the inputs when the component is loaded. Now what we want to do is, what we want to handle change when there is a change in the event. So imagine the value of the input. We come here, we go into the flow builder and we change the value. So accordingly, that input value has to be stored within the flow builder context. So it knows what value is actually, or what is the new value, so it can store it. So we do that by using the events that we discussed. So we say on change, I think on change is the right, and we will say handle input change handler, and we will add the same here. Oh, the value. Then we add a handler function here. It will take uh, this. And what we have to do now is we have to update the flow input. So the way we do it is, if we look at the documentation, so where is the documentation? Right, let's go here, and let's go here and look at the event section. So you see event types, and it says that to report input value changes to the flow builder, dispatch events from the custom property editor, uh, and then you have to set the bubbles and compose to true when you are creating the event. And these are the properties that are available when you are building the, or that are available in the input, sorry, the event of the flow. So this is how typically it would look like. So we can just copy paste this and keep it short. So that's what I have done. What we actually can do is refactor this a bit. We will say value is input variable name, value, and yeah, that's basically it. Yeah. Oh yeah, the type. So the type, we know that it will be string, but we will still keep it as an input. So here you see, uh, let's call it updated value. Okay, so we found the issue with the documentation. Apparently, the way you should do it is like this. So new value equals updated value. It's a property. So you should be passing this, and then it's new value data type, so we simply use the input here, saying data type, and I think this is fine. Here we have some indentation issue. Okay, everything looks good. Cancelable equals false, bubbles equals true, compose equals true, dispatch this event. We can remove this, and then we should be able to call this here. Alright, so this dot this, and the way we will do this is, if you see, look at the name property, so that's why we use the str1, so it's easier for us. There are different ways to do this when you are actually building a CP for a much more complex component, but to get things started and keep it simple, this is how I'll do this. So event dot target, I think, event dot target, not name, and then I think also for the value, how it works is, let me think. Uh, Updated value should be event dot detail, I think, of value. Yeah, that's how it should be, if I remember correctly. All right, and what you also might want to do here is, what we can, because since we need to also update this, so this value, because uh, yeah, because this is an input, or you are storing the input here, so what we can do is we actually can pass the whole event itself, and say string, let's call it string, and here what we can do is this comma input variable name equals event dot detail dot value. You could also have done just pass the event and uh, just pass the event and then use event.target.name here. Either way, it doesn't really matter. I think what we should usually do here is we can do, let's call it updated value. I think this is more consistent and nicer way to do it. So I think we are good. All we need to do is save our stuff and let's see if it works. So let's see. If you can't see it, it's basically pushing the source. Oops. Let's go to output. Okay, so everything ran as, everything is deployed. So if we now go back to our flow builder and let's hit refresh, reload, we will do screen flow like this. It's very annoying. I'll do freeform, and now if I get my action, let's say concat string, it should load the two inputs, string 1 and string 2. That's right. Now you can make it fancy and whatever. So for now, I'll just hard code a string value. Let's say park and then dreaming, and I say concat stuff. concat string, and I'll use something like this, which says display text. That was additional. This output. Oh, output. Let's call it output screen. And in here, no, in here we will say output from concatenated string. Finally, we can say done. Okay, so this is the very simple way of like testing this flow and the action that it works. So let's debug this. Please be a little faster. Okay, let's do this. Part remain, that works nice. Okay, so but the question is, what if we want to let's say if we want to have inputs first name and last name, and then we want to concatenate. So we are taking one step ahead and using text, two text inputs. We call this as fn. Let's call it fn required. Let's call it ln, and then required finish. Oh, we can't finish because the input, and we can say done. This should work. Now what the changes we need to make here is we need to bind the inputs or fn and ln, first name and last name, to your apex action. So the way you normally do is by reference by the merge syntax. So as you do with in your flows normally, if you want to reference a variable, so that's what we are going to do here. We will do this, and we will say ln. Actually, before that, what I would like to see is, if I refresh this again, will I see the values here being stored? Because that's what we used. That's why we used a function that is set flow inputs, so that when it renders, it gets the inputs that was set the last day or the last time. So let's hit it again. Okay, so we are definitely doing it right. So input is indeed getting set to the value, expected value. So now what we will do is, let's do fn, and similarly let's do ln, and we save it, and let's try to debug it. And if we say ln, let's say pk trim, fingers crossed, let's hope this works. Okay, so it worked. We did everything fine, and it looks like everything is working. So let's hit a quick refresh and see if the inputs are actually loaded when we load the component, and then we can say at them, oh yes. So as you can see, our inputs are being loaded correctly. So yeah, this is how you can build a web custom property editors for your apex action, or and also for your through screen component. There are different layers of complexity because there is so much of reusable code that you can use. So you can also try that, where you create a Lightning Web component with all the utility functions, and then you reference that utility component within your custom property editors throughout your All right, so I'll be linking all the documents and links related to the relevant documents within the presentation. So yeah, thank you very much. That's all for this session. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll be more than happy to engage.